I let my father believe I was too busy to call. His doctor knew my work schedule by heart. People will build an entire architecture of protection around you out of silence, and you will mistake that architecture for indifference, because silence is the one language you never bothered to learn how to read. I found that out in an oncology office on the fourth floor of a medical building on East Colfax in Denver, sitting across from a physician named Dr. Anita Reyes, who told me, without my having said a single word about it, that she knew I had standing calls every Monday and Thursday at 9, and that I closed my firm's quarterly reports during the first week of every month. I had never met this woman before that afternoon. What I did wrong is simple enough that I don't need to dress it up for you. My father needed me, specifically and repeatedly, over the better part of 2 years, and I let him believe, because it was easier for both of us, that I was simply too busy to notice. I want to say, before I get further into this, that I'm not telling you this story so you'll rush to forgive me for it, and I'd ask you to hold off on that instinct if it starts to show up early, because I hadn't earned it yet at the point in the story where you'd feel it, and I'm honestly not sure I've fully earned it by the end either. I let a man who spent 31 years teaching other people's children carry a cancer diagnosis largely alone, on a schedule he built entirely around not inconveniencing me. I'd rather you sit with that plainly for a while before I let you feel any better about it. My name is Erin Kessler. I'm 34 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado. And I'm a senior manager at a management consulting firm downtown, on track, at the time all of this happened, for a partnership decision that would come the following spring. I want to walk you through exactly how I got to that oncology office, because the version of this story I told myself for 2 years, the version where I was simply a woman with an unusually demanding job and an unusually understanding father, leaves out almost everything that actually matters. Let me back up. You need to understand who my father was before any of this happened. Because if I start with the missed calls themselves, you'll misread both of us, and I've spent 2 years letting the wrong reading stand uncorrected, including in my own head. My father, Robert Kessler, Bob to everyone except his students, who called him Mr. Kessler for 31 years at a public high school in Aurora, where he taught American history and coached the debate team on the side without ever once being paid extra for it. He retired the year I finished graduate school, and my mother died 4 years after that, quickly, from a stroke that gave the family almost no time to prepare for it. Which meant my father spent the back half of his 60s living alone in the same 3-bedroom house on Fenton Street where I'd grown up, keeping her garden alive out of what I understood, even then, as something closer to devotion than habit. I remember, distinctly, the spring after my mother died, coming home for a weekend and finding my father out in that garden at 6 a.m, still in his robe, carefully staking her tomato plants exactly the way she used to, using a technique she'd developed over decades that he'd apparently watched her do 1,000 times, without ever once doing it himself while she was alive. I asked him why he was out there so early, and he said, without looking up from the stakes, if I let it go even one season, it stops being her garden and starts being an empty patch of dirt. I'm not ready for that yet. He kept that garden meticulously for the rest of his life, and I understand now that maintaining it wasn't really about tomatoes at all. It was the same instinct that would later show up in a spiral desk calendar. The instinct to keep something alive and cared for on someone else's behalf, quietly, without ever asking for credit or acknowledgement. He had a specific routine that defined our relationship for most of my adult life. Every Sunday morning, 9 o'clock exactly, no exceptions, he'd call, and we'd talk for anywhere between 10 minutes and an hour, depending on what was happening in either of our lives that week. He called it the Sunday check-in, and he had a habit at the end of nearly every one of those calls. of being the one to end it first, saying, "All right, I'll let you go," even in the middle of conversations that clearly weren't finished, even when I could tell he wanted to keep talking. I used to think that habit was simply politeness, an old teacher's instinct for reading a room and knowing when a lesson had run its course. I understand now that it was something more deliberate than that, a lifelong practice of never once wanting to be the reason his daughter's time got away from her. He had another habit, smaller, that I didn't think much of until much later. Whenever I mentioned being stressed about a deadline or a client or a flight, he'd say, almost reflexively, "Don't worry about me, I'm fine." Inserted into the conversation regardless of whether I'd asked how he was doing, as though preemptively closing off a line of concern before it could become an obligation on my calendar. I heard that sentence probably 1,000 times over the years and understood it, for most of my adult life, as simply my father being self-sufficient, low maintenance, easy. I understand it differently now. I think it was the exact same instinct as ending the call first, a man clearing space for me before I ever had to ask for it, so consistently that I stopped noticing the space was being cleared at all. The family dynamic worth being honest about is this. I'm an only child, which meant that after my mother died, my father's entire remaining family, in any practical sense, was me. There was no sibling to share the weight of his aging, no spouse of my own yet to help carry the logistics, no built-in excuse for distributing attention that wasn't entirely mine to distribute or withhold. I think that fact, more than anything else, is what let the specific shape of my wrongdoing take root, because there was no one else watching closely enough to name what was happening while it was still happening. My father's longtime next-door neighbor, Riesa Alvarez, a retired ICU nurse, who'd known our family for over 20 years, became, in practice, the closest thing to a second family member in this story, though she'd be the first to tell you that role was never supposed to fall to her as heavily as it eventually did. I should say, too, that money was never really the tension in our family the way it is in some of these stories. My father's teacher's pension combined with what he and my mother had saved carefully over 3 decades meant he was comfortable, not wealthy, but never in any danger of the kind of precarity that sometimes forces families into difficult, resentful proximity. If anything, the absence of financial pressure between us made the emotional distance easier to maintain. Because there was never a bill, a loan, an inheritance question forcing regular contact. We could go weeks without any practical reason to speak beyond the Sunday check-in, and for 2 years, that's essentially what we did. There were 3 specific things about my father that mattered more than I understood at the time, things I want you to hold on to, because all 3 of them come back around later in this story in a way I didn't see coming. The first was the Sunday check-in itself, and his habit of ending it first. The second was that sentence, "Don't worry about me, I'm fine," repeated so often it had become a kind of background static I'd stopped consciously hearing. The third was a small spiral desk calendar he kept by the kitchen phone his entire life, the old-fashioned kind with a page for every day, where he wrote down, in a teacher's neat block printing, small notes about upcoming events, my birthday, dentist appointments, the garden's watering schedule, and, though I didn't know this until much later, an increasingly detailed record of my own professional calendar, transcribed from things I'd mentioned offhand on those Sunday calls, kept with a level of care that had nothing to do with his own life at all. I built a career in management consulting the way a lot of people in that industry build one, through relentless availability, a willingness to be on a plane by 6 a.m. and in a client's conference room by 9, a reputation for never once being the person on the project team who said no to an unreasonable timeline. By my early 30s, I'd made senior manager at a firm downtown. One of the youngest in the office to hit that title, with a partnership decision looming the following spring that everyone, myself included, understood to be contingent on exactly the kind of visible, uninterrupted commitment I'd spent a decade cultivating. The wrong I did, the one this whole story is built around, started on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Roughly 2 years before that oncology office, when my father called outside our normal Sunday window, which itself should have told me something, since he never once in years of the Sunday check-in called me mid-week without a genuinely important reason. He told me, in a voice that was steadier than I think the news warranted, that he'd found a lump during a routine check and that his doctor wanted to run a biopsy the following Thursday, and he asked, carefully, almost apologetically, whether I might be able to come with him to that appointment, since the doctor had mentioned the results conversation could be difficult to sit through alone. I remember exactly where I was when he called, standing in the kitchen of my old apartment before the townhouse, a laptop open on the counter with a merger valuation model half finished on the screen, a call with a client scheduled for 40 minutes later. I remember the specific quality of his voice, careful in a way that told me he'd rehearsed the sentence before dialing, the way you rehearse something you're afraid will land as a burden. I was, at that exact moment, 3 days into finalizing a merger valuation for a client acquisition my firm had been pursuing for 8 months, the kind of deliverable that, if it went well, would sit directly on the partnership committee's desk as evidence of my readiness for the promotion everyone assumed was mine to lose. I told my father, that Tuesday, that Thursday was genuinely impossible, that I had a client presentation I couldn't move, and I asked whether Risa, my father's longtime next-door neighbor, might be able to go with him instead. He said, in the same steady voice, "Of course. Don't worry about it, Risa's happy to help. You focus on your presentation." I remember feeling, in that moment, a very specific, very familiar relief, the relief of a request being withdrawn before I had to fully feel the weight of denying it. I want to describe exactly what I told myself in the days and weeks after that call, because I think the reasoning matters more than the guilt does if you actually want to understand how a person does something like this. I told myself that a biopsy consultation was a single appointment, not a crisis, and that my presence there wasn't medically necessary the way my presence in a merger negotiation room genuinely was. I told myself that my father, of all people, understood the stakes of a partnership year better than almost anyone, having spent 31 years watching young teachers claw for tenure-track positions, and that he would never actually want me jeopardizing something that significant for a single doctor's visit. I told myself, underneath all of that this was simply the first of what would surely be many appointments over whatever this turned out to be, and that I could show up fully for the ones that actually mattered once I had a clearer sense of what mattered meant in this context. I believed, genuinely, in the moment, that all of those things were reasonable. I would come to understand, 2 years later, sitting across from Dr. Reyes, exactly how thoroughly I'd used reasonableness as a shield against a decision that was never really about scheduling at all. I also told myself something quieter, something I've never said out loud to anyone until now. I told myself that if I let this diagnosis become a defining feature of that particular quarter, some part of the partnership committee's read on me would shift, subtly, from relentlessly available to distracted by family circumstances. A shift I had watched happen to at least one other senior manager in my cohort 2 years earlier. A man who'd taken several weeks off for his wife's surgery and had, whether fairly or not, seen his own partnership timeline quietly extended by a full cycle afterward. I was, underneath every reasonable-sounding justification, protecting a perception, and I understood that even then. In the moment, more clearly than I let myself admit. There was an off-ramp in that stretch of days, and I want to be honest that I saw it clearly and chose not to take it. My direct supervisor on the merger engagement, a partner named Douglas Chen, who'd mentored me for years and who genuinely liked me, noticed I seemed distracted during a working session that same week and asked, in the kind of casual way senior people ask junior people things when they actually want a real answer, whether everything was all right at home. I told him, briefly, about my father's biopsy. Douglas, to his credit, said something I've thought about more than almost anything else from that period, Aaron. If you need to be somewhere Thursday, be there. This deliverable will survive you taking 4 hours off for your father. I promise you the partnership committee is not tracking whether you missed a Thursday morning for a family medical appointment. I told him I appreciated it, but that I'd already made arrangements, that it was under control. Douglas didn't push further, and I've never told him, in the years since, how much I regret not taking him up on an offer that, I understand now, cost me nothing at all to accept. Douglas brought it up one more time, almost 2 weeks later, in a hallway between meetings, asking, casually, how my father's results had come back. I told him, briefly, thyroid cancer, treatable, surgery scheduled, and he said, "Are you doing okay with that?" I told him I was fine, that it was manageable, that Risa was helping out. He looked at me for a beat longer than the conversation required, the way people look at you when they suspect you're underreporting something but don't feel entitled to push further, and said only, "Well, the door's open if that changes." I nodded and went into my next meeting. I didn't walk back through that door for almost 2 years. I sent Risa a fruit basket that Thursday as a thank you for going in my place, a gesture I remember feeling genuinely proud of at the time, as though a $40 basket of pears was an adequate substitute for my own presence in a room where my father learned he had stage 2 thyroid cancer. Risa called me that evening after the appointment to walk me through what the doctor had said, relaying information secondhand that I now understand I should have heard directly, in the room, in real time. Watching my father's face while he absorbed it, rather than hearing it filtered through a kind neighbor's careful retelling 3 hours later over the phone. I want to be fair to Risa here, because she's carried more of this story than anyone outside my father himself, and I don't want to make her sound like a substitute daughter stepping into a role she'd angled for. She never once, in 2 years, suggested to me that I should be doing more, never once made me feel judged on the phone. Even though I understand now that she must have watched the whole pattern unfold at close range and had every right to say something directly. I asked her much later, after everything had come out, why she'd never confronted me about it herself. She said, simply, "It wasn't my place to tell you how to be a daughter, Aaron. Your father made his choices about what to tell you, and I respected them, even when I didn't fully agree with them. I figured if anyone was going to open that door, it needed to be him, not me standing in for him." I've thought about that answer often, because I think it's a more generous read of the situation than I deserved at the time. For the better part of the next 2 years, this same pattern repeated itself with a consistency I didn't fully register until it was pointed out to me by someone outside the situation entirely. My father's treatment, surgery that spring, followed by radioactive iodine therapy, followed by a long stretch of quarterly monitoring scans, generated a steady rhythm of appointments, most of which fell on weekdays, most of which I was, by some combination of genuine and manufactured circumstance, unable to attend. I called on Sundays, faithfully, and asked how things were going, and he told me, faithfully, some version of everything's on track, or nothing new to report, language vague enough that I never had to ask a genuinely hard follow-up question, and specific enough that I could tell myself I was staying informed. I told colleagues, when his illness came up at all, some version of my dad's dealing with a health thing, but he's got great doctors and a good neighbor helping out. He's very independent. a sentence that made the whole situation sound managed and low stakes, which is exactly, I understand now. The impression my father had been carefully constructing on his end of every Sunday call for me to receive. My career, in that same stretch, accelerated on exactly the trajectory I'd been protecting. I made partner the following spring, the merger deal, having closed successfully, my name attached to it in every internal document that mattered. I bought a townhouse in the Highlands with the signing bonus. I started dating someone, a man named Marcus, who met my father exactly twice in 18 months, both times briefly, both times at my initiative on days that happened to already be convenient for me. I remember Marcus asking, gently, after the second visit, whether my father seemed smaller than Marcus had expected from how I described him, a word I brushed off at the time as an odd observation from someone who barely knew either of us well enough to make it, and that I've thought about often since, because it was, in fact, an entirely accurate one. I want to be specific about what those two visits actually looked like, because I think the brevity itself tells you something. The first was a 40-minute lunch near my father's house, scheduled around a flight I had that same afternoon, during which my father asked Marcus thoughtful, genuine questions about his career, and I spent most of the meal checking the time. The second, nearly a year later, was a holiday dinner I'd shortened deliberately because I had an early morning client call the next day, and I remember my father, walking us to the car afterward, saying, "Come back soon, both of you, whenever you have more time," a sentence I registered as ordinary politeness and now understand as a direct, gentle request that I simply never followed up on. There were cracks in that 2-year stretch, small enough that I filed each one away rather than examine it directly. About 8 months in, Risa texted me a photo from a scan follow-up appointment she'd driven my father to, the two of them in a waiting room, and I noticed, looking at the photo longer than I meant to, that my father had lost enough weight that his cardigan hung differently on him than I remembered. I told myself it was the radioactive iodine treatment, temporary, expected, and didn't call to ask any specific questions about it. About 14 months in, I let a Tuesday call from my father go to voicemail during a client dinner and didn't listen to the message for 5 days, and when I finally did, it was just him mentioning, almost as an aside near the end, that his most recent scan had shown something the doctor wants to keep an eye on. A sentence I noted and then let dissolve into the noise of an unusually demanding week, telling myself I'd follow up properly on the next Sunday call. Which I did, briefly, accepting his reassurance at face value rather than pressing further. About 20 months in, driving past Aurora on my way to a client site, I thought seriously, for the length of about one exit ramp, about pulling off and surprising him with an actual visit instead of a phone call, and then decided I didn't have the time that particular week and kept driving. There was one more crack, closer to the end of that stretch, that I've thought about more than the others since. It was my father's 70th birthday, and I flew in for a single evening, a dinner at his favorite steakhouse in Aurora, the kind of visit I'd built into a habit by then. Brief, warm, entirely on my schedule, gone again by the next morning's flight. Over dinner, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd started using a cane just for longer walks, nothing serious, a detail I remember registering with mild concern and then setting aside, distracted by a work email that had come in during the appetizer course that I checked under the table without fully thinking about how it looked. I flew home the next morning as planned. I didn't think about the cane again for months. Until it came up in a very different context, in a hospital room, described not as nothing serious at all, but as one of the earliest visible signs of a decline that had already been under active medical management for the better part of a year by that point. I want to be honest that I wasn't tormented during those 2 years, which is the detail that troubles me most in retrospect. I wasn't lying awake at night riddled with guilt about my father's cancer. I was, by almost every external measure, thriving, newly made partner, financially comfortable in a way I hadn't been a few years earlier, in a relationship that felt stable, building exactly the kind of life the version of me from graduate school would have recognized as a clear success. My father's illness didn't announce itself as a daily crisis in that life. It became, instead, a background fact I managed the way I managed everything else, efficiently, at a controlled distance, checked in on according to a schedule, rather than according to need. I also want to be honest about a conversation I had with Marcus about a year and a half into all of this that I brushed off at the time and have returned to often since. We were driving back from a weekend trip, and he asked, out of nowhere, whether I ever worried I'd regret not seeing my father more given his diagnosis. I told him my father was doing fine, that we talked every Sunday, that I didn't think there was anything to regret because nothing about the situation was actually urgent. Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said, "You say doing fine about him the same way you'd say it about a client account that's on track." I don't know your dad well, obviously, but from the outside it doesn't really sound like fine. It sounds like managed. I told him he didn't understand the situation as well as I did, which was, "I understand now." The exact wrong response to the one honest observation anyone made to me during that entire 2-year window. The discovery that finally broke this open didn't come from a document or a phone call from a stranger, the way I understand these things sometimes happen in other people's stories. It came from an emergency room visit, 23 months after that first Tuesday call. When Risa called me on a Thursday afternoon in January to tell me my father had collapsed in his kitchen and been taken by ambulance to a hospital on East Colfax, and that whatever something to keep an eye on had meant on that scan 14 months earlier had, in the time since, become considerably more serious than either of us had understood it to be. I remember almost nothing about the drive itself except the specific panic of realizing, somewhere around the Colorado Boulevard exit, that I genuinely did not know the name of my father's oncologist, had never once asked, had let 2 years of appointments pass through Reese's careful second-hand summaries without ever once needing a name or a face to attach to the person actually managing my father's care. I found that fact almost unbearable, sitting in traffic, more unbearable in some ways than the collapse itself, because it told me plainly how completely I had outsourced my own father's illness to other people's attention. I drove to Denver that same afternoon, breaking every speed limit on I-25, and by the time I arrived my father had been stabilized and moved to observation, and a physician named Dr. Anita Reyes, his treating oncologist for the better part of 2 years, someone I had genuinely never once met or spoken to despite being listed, apparently, as his emergency contact, asked to speak with me privately in a small consultation room down the hall from his bed. She started, before I'd said more than my own name, by telling me she understood I worked in management consulting, that I had standing client calls most Mondays and Thursdays at 9 in the morning, and that I typically closed quarterly reports during the first week of every month, a period during which, she said, your father specifically asked us never to schedule anything that might require his own family to be pulled away from work commitments, unless it was genuinely unavoidable. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, how she knew any of that. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I've thought about more than almost any other single moment in this story, not judgment exactly. More like a kind of careful professional sadness, the expression of someone about to tell you something she suspects you don't yet know you need to hear. Your father has been extraordinarily specific with our scheduling team for almost 2 years, she said. He kept what I can only describe as a working calendar of your professional obligations, updated regularly, that he'd share with our front desk whenever we were setting his next appointment. He didn't want appointments landing on days he believed would conflict with something important for you, even appointments you weren't going to attend yourself. I asked him about it directly, once maybe 8 months ago, because it struck me as unusual, and he told me, I remember this almost word for word. Because it's stayed with me since, he told me, my daughter doesn't need to know how many of these there actually are. She has enough on her plate. I just need the ones I actually need her for to land on days she can say yes to. I asked Dr. Reyes to explain what she meant by days she can say yes to, and she said, carefully, that my father had apparently developed a working sense. Over 2 years of Sunday phone calls he'd never described as anything more than ordinary family check-ins, of which weeks of my year tended to be lighter and which tended to be heavier, and that he'd used that working sense to decide, unilaterally, which appointments were worth asking me to attend and which weren't. He wasn't just protecting your time from all of his appointments, she said. He was rationing his own requests for your presence, very deliberately, so that when he did ask, the ask would actually land, rather than becoming background noise you'd learned to tune out, because it happened too often. I asked Dr. Reyes, because I needed to hear the full shape of what I was only beginning to understand, exactly how many appointments that had actually been, how many scans, consultations, treatment sessions, over the 2 years since the original diagnosis. She pulled up his chart and read through it with me, slowly, and the number that emerged was considerably higher than the handful I'd been aware of, closer to 40 separate appointments across 2 years, the vast majority of which I had never known were happening at all, because they'd been carefully scheduled around a calendar that existed, as far as I knew, only in my father's spiral desk notebook by the kitchen phone. There's one more thing I think you should know, Doctor, Reyes said, and this is the piece of hard evidence I have never been able to explain away since, no matter how many times I've turned it over. About 14 months ago, we found a secondary site that concerned us considerably more than anything up to that point, the finding you may remember him mentioning as something to keep an eye on. It required a more invasive follow-up procedure, and normally I would have insisted on a family member present for that conversation, given what we were discussing. Your father asked me, directly, not to frame it that way to you. He said, and again I'm quoting him as closely as I can, "Don't tell her this one's serious. Tell her it's routine monitoring. If she hears the word serious, she'll drop everything, and I know exactly what dropping everything would cost her right now. Because she told me herself, more than once, how much this year matters for her career. I'd rather carry this myself than watch her lose something she's worked 15 years for. I want you to understand, Aaron, that I pushed back on that request. More than once. He was firm about it every time. I asked Dr. Reyes whether she'd ever considered simply overriding him, calling me directly regardless of his instructions, given how serious that finding had actually been. She said she'd considered it seriously more than once and had ultimately decided against it because he remained, throughout, entirely competent to make decisions about his own care and his own disclosures, and that overriding a competent patient's explicit wishes about how his family received information wasn't a line she was willing to cross, however much it troubled her personally to honor it. I want to be honest with you, she said. There were nights I went home and thought about that decision and wasn't sure I'd made the right one. I still don't know, fully, if I did. But it wasn't really mine to make instead of his. Before I left her office that first afternoon, Dr. Reyes told me one more thing, almost as an aside, that I've come to think of as the quietest and most devastating detail in the entire discovery. Your father asked me, at the very start, back at the original diagnosis, whether cancer patients who go through treatment mostly alone tend to do worse, psychologically, than ones with a lot of family support in the room. I told him the research is mixed, that it depends heavily on the person. He asked a follow-up question I've never forgotten. He asked, what if the person going through it alone is doing it on purpose, to protect someone else's year? Does the research say anything about that? I told him I didn't think anyone had studied that particular question. He said, that's all right, I'm not doing it for the research, I'm doing it for her. I sat in that consultation room for a long time after Dr. Reyes finished speaking, and I want to describe the specific quality of what I felt, because I think it matters more than a simple description of grief or guilt. What I felt, primarily, in that first hour, was disorientation. The sensation of discovering that an entire structure I'd built my last 2 years on top of, a structure where my father was managed, stable, low maintenance, essentially fine, had never actually existed at all. It had been constructed, deliberately and at enormous cost, by the one person in the story I'd been treating as the least demanding, least complicated part of my life. I misjudged what my father was capable of carrying alone, and more specifically, I misjudged my own understanding of what "don't worry about me, I'm fine" had actually meant. Every single time he'd said it. I had spent 2 years hearing that sentence as reassurance. I understand now that it was closer to a shield he was holding up in front of both of us, protecting me from the weight of his illness, and protecting himself, I think, from having to watch me choose my career over him a second time, a third time, a fourth, in the specific, undramatic way I'd already chosen it that first Thursday in March. I thought back to the Sunday check-ins, to his habit of ending the call first, saying, all right, I'll let you go even in the middle of conversations that clearly weren't finished, and understood it now as the exact same instinct scaled up to cover an entire cancer diagnosis, a lifelong practice of clearing space for me before I ever had to ask for it. Applied, in the end, to something far larger than a phone call running long. I thought about the spiral desk calendar by the kitchen phone, the neat block printing, and understood that the increasingly detailed record of my professional calendar he'd apparently kept there for years hadn't been idle curiosity about my career. It had been a working document, maintained with the same discipline he'd once brought to lesson plans, built entirely around a single goal, making sure his own decline never once became my emergency, on his terms, without my consent, and without my knowledge. I thought, too, about the tomato garden, about a man who couldn't let something he loved become an empty patch of dirt even after the person who'd tended it was gone. And understood that I had been the beneficiary of that exact same refusal for 2 years, a father unwilling to let his own decline become a wasteland in my life either, tending to his silence about it with the same daily, unglamorous discipline he'd once brought to staking my mother's tomato plants at 6 a.m. There is a confrontation scene in this story, and it happened 3 days later, once my father was stable enough to have a real conversation, sitting up in a hospital bed with a view of the parking garage instead of anything worth looking at. I asked him directly, no rehearsed language, no leadership seminar softening, why he'd hidden the severity of it from me for over a year. Because you would have come, he said. And I didn't want you coming out of fear. I wanted you to come because you actually had the time to give me, not because I'd frightened you into finding time you didn't really have. I told him that wasn't his decision to make alone, that I'd had a right to know what was actually happening to my own father. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, maybe. But I've watched a lot of families in that waiting room over 2 years, Erin. I've watched kids drop out of school programs, lose jobs, drain savings, all rushing to be present for things that, half the time, didn't actually need them present, not medically. I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to have the career you'd earned, and I wanted to still be your father while you had it, not a project that derailed it. I asked him, my voice barely functioning by that point, whether he understood what it felt like, hearing all of this from a doctor, instead of from him. He looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, I do understand that. I thought about that part a lot, actually, more than you'd probably believe. I decided I'd rather you be angry at me for protecting you too much than for costing you the years you've built for yourself. I made that decision knowing it might cost me your trust. I made it anyway. I asked him one more question before I left the hospital that first night, whether Risa had known the full extent of it. Whether I'd been the only one kept at that particular distance. He said no, that Risa had known almost everything, because she'd been the one physically present for most of it, and there was no practical way to keep the truth from someone driving him to every appointment. That's different, he said, when I pointed out the apparent unfairness of that distinction. Risa was never going to be asked to give anything up because of it. You would have. That's the whole difference, Aaron. It was never about who I trusted more. It was about who had more to lose. He paused, then added, more quietly, I also knew Risa wouldn't build a whole life around not asking me hard questions the way I worried you might if I let the fear get big enough. I needed at least one person in the room who wasn't managing me. I didn't have an answer to that either, not that night. I sat with him until visiting hours ended, mostly in silence, the two of us watching a muted television bolted to the wall, and I remember thinking, driving back to Reese's guest room that I'd be staying in for the next several weeks, that I had spent 2 years being protected by a man who could no longer stand up without a cane, and that the protection had never once, not for a single day, been about anything other than love applied with a precision I hadn't earned and didn't yet know how to properly receive. I called Risa that same night, from her guest room, mostly because I needed to say some version of what I was feeling out loud to someone who'd actually witnessed the 2 years I'd only just started to understand. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, gently, I watched you both do this to each other, in a way. He protected you from the truth, and you let yourself be protected, and I don't think either one of you ever sat down and asked whether that arrangement was actually working for the other person. I asked her if she thought I was as much at fault as he was. She was quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, I think you're at fault for different things. He's at fault for deciding, alone, what you could handle. You're at fault for never once asking hard enough to make that decision harder for him to make. I've thought about that distinction more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire 6-week leave. The repair since that hospital room has been slower than I wanted it to be, and I've come to think that's appropriate rather than unfortunate. I asked my firm the following week for an extended leave, something close to 2 months, to be present for the remainder of his treatment in a way I hadn't been for the 2 years prior. Douglas Chen, the partner who'd offered me that Thursday off 2 years earlier, approved it within a day and told me simply, this is exactly what I meant back then. I'm glad you're finally taking it. I moved back into the house on Fenton Street for 6 weeks, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, driving my father to every single appointment on a calendar that I finally, for the first time, saw in full, in his own handwriting, laid out across a full year rather than filtered through the vague reassurances of a Sunday phone call. My father didn't make this easy for me, in the specific way I think mattered most. He didn't simply accept my sudden, intense presence with open gratitude, the way I think some part of me had hoped he would. About 2 weeks into the leave, sitting in a waiting room together before a scan, he said, without preamble, I don't want you doing this out of guilt, Aaron. If that's what this is, I'd almost rather you go back to work. I told him it wasn't guilt, or not only guilt, that it was also, finally, an accurate accounting of what actually mattered to me, updated to match what I now understood to be true. He accepted that answer, but he didn't fully relax around it for several more weeks, testing it, I think, the way you test a repaired bridge before you're willing to trust your full weight on it again. There was a specific afternoon, about 4 weeks into the leave, that I think marked the real turning point between us, more than the hospital confrontation itself. We were sitting on the back porch, looking out at my mother's garden, which I'd started helping him tend to that spring, and he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I remembered the exact tomato staking technique my mother used to use. I told him I didn't, not really, that I'd been too young to pay close attention. He said, "I'll teach you, if you want. Someone should know it besides me." I understood that offer as something larger than gardening advice, an invitation into the specific ongoing work of keeping something alive that mattered to him. Extended for the first time in 2 years without any accompanying instinct to protect me from the effort of it. I asked him, near the end of that 6-week leave, whether I could see the actual spiral calendar, the one he'd kept by the kitchen phone for years, and he hesitated before handing it over, the way you hesitate before showing someone a diary. Page after page, going back nearly 2 full years, held small, careful annotations next to medical appointments. Erin has board prep this week, keep light. Q1 close, do not schedule. Erin traveling for Denver acquisition, Risa will drive, an entire second calendar, invisible to me the whole time, built exclusively around protecting a schedule I'd never once asked him to protect. I sat with that notebook open on my lap for almost an hour, reading entry after entry, and I remember him watching me read it, not saying anything, letting me take in the full scope of it at my own pace, the same patience he'd shown at the end of 1,000 Sunday calls, applied now to something considerably heavier than a phone conversation running long. I made one concrete gesture of repair that I think mattered to him more than anything else I did that spring. I went back to Dr. Reyes's office, on my own, and asked her to change the standing instruction in my father's file. I told her that from that point forward, I wanted to be informed of everything, every appointment, every finding, however minor, and that if my father ever again asked her to soften bad news for my benefit, I wanted her to tell him gently that I'd specifically requested otherwise. Dr. Reyes made the change and told me, as I was leaving, for what it's worth, I don't think many families ever come back and ask for this correction. Most people, once the crisis passes, go back to not wanting to know too much. I think it says something that you didn't. I didn't have a response to that. I still don't have a complete one. I also called Douglas Chen, once I was back at the firm full-time, and asked whether the firm would consider building a more formal caregiving leave policy, something more structured than the informal, case-by-case accommodation he'd extended to me twice, once offered, and once actually taken. He was receptive, and I ended up co-chairing a working group with 2 other partners that spring that resulted 18 months later in a genuine policy change, 6 weeks of protected leave for employees managing a parent's serious illness, without penalty to review cycles or promotion timelines. It's a small thing in the scope of a firm that size. I think about it, though, every time someone in a junior role tells me, the way I once told Douglas, that everything's under control and they don't need to take the time being offered to them. I try to say to them exactly what Douglas said to me, and I try to actually mean it the way I think he did. I told Marcus, too, once things had settled somewhat, that he'd been right about the word managed. That conversation in the car after the weekend trip that I'd brushed off so quickly at the time. He didn't say I told you so, which I appreciated more than I let on. He just asked whether I wanted him to come with me on my next visit to Fenton Street, and I said yes, And he did, and my father, meeting him properly for the first time in nearly 2 years. Spent almost the entire visit asking him detailed, genuinely curious questions about his work, the same careful attentiveness he'd apparently spent 2 years quietly extending toward mine. My father's most recent scans, as of this recording, show no active disease, though he remains, at 71, on a quarterly monitoring schedule that I now track myself, in my own calendar. In my own handwriting, a small, deliberate mirror of the one he kept for me without my ever asking him to. I think, sometimes, about what would have happened if I'd simply gone to that first biopsy consultation 2 years ago, taken the 4 hours Douglas Chen told me correctly that I could afford to take. I don't know that it would have changed the underlying cancer or its course. I know it would have meant my father never had to build an entire second calendar, in secret, to manage a version of me he'd decided, somewhere in that first Tuesday phone call, was too fragile and too important to burden with the truth of his own decline. I don't want to end this sounding like everything between us is fully resolved, because I don't think it is, and claiming otherwise would be its own small dishonesty, the exact kind that got me here in the first place. My father and I are closer now than we've been since I was a teenager, doing homework at the kitchen table while he graded papers across from me, and I still catch myself, occasionally, on a Sunday call, starting to reach for the old vague reassurance, everything's fine, nothing new to report, before I catch the reflex and correct it, choosing instead to actually describe how my week went, in real detail, the way I now ask him to describe his. I don't think that reflex disappears completely. Once you've spent 2 years building an entire relationship's worth of communication around protecting each other from inconvenient truths, I think you just get better, slowly, Sunday by Sunday, at noticing the reflex before it wins, one honest answer at a time, in place of the tidy one that used to come so much easier to both of us. I've started keeping my own version of the Sunday check-in tradition now, in a small way. I call him Wednesdays too. No occasion required. A small, unscheduled gesture that costs me almost nothing, and that I understand now, better than I ever did before, can mean everything to the person quietly waiting on the other end of it. My father still keeps that spiral notebook by the kitchen phone, though its contents have changed since I saw it that spring. He showed me a recent page a few months ago, and instead of appointment annotations built around my work calendar, it now holds something closer to an ordinary family calendar, my birthday, an upcoming visit, a note about a tomato variety he wants to try next season. The two of us finally, after 2 years, keeping simple track of an ordinary life together rather than a set of carefully managed absences. I asked him if I could take a photo of that page, and he let me, a little self-consciously, the way he used to react whenever I photographed anything that felt too sentimental for a man who'd spent 31 years keeping his classroom voice steady in front of teenagers. I keep that photo on my phone now, next to almost nothing else. A small, ordinary record of what it looks like when neither of us is protecting the other from the truth of an ordinary Tuesday. I asked him once, more recently, whether he ever regretted the 2 years of silence, given how it all eventually came out anyway. He thought about the question for a long moment, the way he thinks about most things worth answering honestly, and said, "I regret that it took an ambulance to bring you all the way back. I don't regret trying to protect the years you were building for yourself. I just wish I'd trusted you to help me protect them too, instead of deciding I had to do it alone." I think that's the most honest accounting either of us has managed to give the other about all of it. And I think it's probably the truest thing either of us is capable of saying, even now. I've stopped waiting for a cleaner version of that answer. I don't think one exists, and I've come to believe that wanting one would just be another form of the same old habit, asking for the tidy summary instead of sitting with the whole, complicated truth. The thing I'd say to you, if you recognize any part of yourself in this, is that the people who love you best rarely announce the shape of what they're protecting you from. They simply absorb it, quietly, on a schedule built entirely around your convenience, and they get so good at it that you can go years mistaking their carefulness for the absence of any real cost at all. There was always a cost. My father just decided, for 2 years, that he'd rather carry it silently than watch me choose, over and over, in real time, exactly how much of him I was actually willing to make room for. I think about Dr. Reyes sometimes too, and the specific position she was in for 2 years, bound by a competent patient's wishes. Watching a daughter she'd never met remain entirely unaware of what her own father was carrying, unable to intervene even when it clearly troubled her to stay silent. I called her office a few months after that first meeting, just to thank her properly, and to tell her that the standing instruction had been changed, that I was showing up now, in every sense the word allows. She said, "I'm glad. For what it's worth, I don't think your father regrets a single day of what he did. I think he'd tell you, if you asked him directly, that it worked exactly the way he intended it to. The only variable he didn't fully account for was how it would feel for you to find out the way you did. I've asked him since whether that's true. He said simply, mostly, I didn't plan on the ambulance. I would have preferred you finding out some gentler way, eventually, on my own timeline. But I don't regret the 2 years themselves. I got to watch you become exactly who you were trying to become, without my illness getting in the way of it. That part, I'd choose again. What I keep from all of this is a photo of a page in that spiral notebook and the memory of a doctor's steady voice reciting my own work calendar back to me with more precision than I'd ever bothered reciting my father's medical calendar to myself. That's the image I return to most when I think about what it actually means to be known by someone who loves you, not the grand gestures, but the small, exact, unglamorous details somebody else was quietly keeping track of the whole time you weren't looking, waiting patiently for the day you'd finally look back. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.